Welcome to Venice Views. I'm Pam Johnson, Marketing and Communications Officer for the City of Venice. This is one of our series of films about the history of Venice, and it's the short history. We're learning about some of the people who still live here, who came in the earlier days, and this is made possible by Visit Florida. So today we're visiting with Dan and Freda Boone. Thanks so much for being here, Dan and Freda. And you all have been here 56 years. So you've seen a lot of things happen in Venice, and you've been part of a lot of that, too. So I thought I would like to ask you a little bit about where you came from. So, Dan...
Well, I could start, I guess. I moved here from Gainesville, Florida, and my connection with Gainesville, Florida was that I spent 7 years at the University of Florida getting an undergraduate degree in Bachelor of Science Business Administration, and then my law degree, and that would be the sort of the start of my legal career. My first job out of law school, you have to learn how to practice law because they don't teach you how to practice law in law school. But my first job was in Lake City, Florida, and I met Freda. She beat me into the law firm by about, 8 or 9 months. And so we met there, and we were 2 or 3 years later, I guess it was. Anyway, we were married and moved to Venice as newlyweds. And we didn't know a soul in Venice. We just came here because I had used my 2-week summer vacation in the first year out of law school, in the second year out of law school. I used that time to find a place in Florida where I would like to move, live, and practice law. I knew that I definitely wanted to live in the south half of the state. Didn't really matter which coast or in the middle of the state. I was looking for what I thought was a good opportunity. I saw Venice and I said, wow, here is a city that's completely platted, has these hundreds of vacant lots, located directly on the Gulf of Mexico. There's no barrier islands. You have to go across a bridge to get to the beach. And I just felt that this is, you can't miss.
What year was that?
1956.
1956. So what did you think, Freda, when he said, here's Venice?
Well, I never heard of it, although I'm a Florida native. I had never been any farther south than Tampa at that time, but I was willing to go if that's where you wanted to go. It's been wonderful. I'm happy that I never want to live anywhere else.
So you were two young, adventurous people striking out to make a new life in a new place. Now, where did you grow up, Dan?
I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee.
And then from there you went to Gainesville, I guess.
Well, yes. From my father was a factory representative for the largest orthopedic manufacturing company in the world, and he had 7 states, 7 southern states, so that he traveled these states. Florida was one of the 7 states, and he absolutely wanted to move to Florida. He wanted us to move to Florida, and my mother just would not hear of it until I finished high school. And within about 2 weeks after I finished high school, they moved to Florida. They moved to Daytona Beach.
They did. Okay, so you're all in Florida then.
Yes, and so we were all in Florida then.
Now, you talk about him traveling around and everything, so I'm going to ask you just an out-of-the-blue question. When was the first time you ever took an airplane ride?
I believe it was when I started flying lessons.
So when was that?
And that was in 1944.
And you took them with a good friend?
Jack Ogle.
Okay. Jack and Marion, who lived here in Venice.
Right. Jack passed away 5 years ago. Marion Ogle, of course, is very much still alive.
Yes.
Very active.
Yes. And so, okay, so we'll come back to that later. Now, you see Venice, and what was here?
There wasn't much here. Through, as you know, BLE, the largest, at that time, the largest labor union in the world, because it was the railroad union. Everything moved by rail. And they wanted a location for a retirement city for their employees. And so as what happened, of course, was that Dr. Albee, who had the property, he sold it to BLE. BLE came in and developed, and when I moved here, not much had happened since the Depression, because well, when BLE, right in the midst of the Depression, when the market crashed, they just pulled out. And when they left, they just left. Some streets had sidewalks down one side and not down the other side. Other streets were not paved. Other streets had a basic paving. It was just, this is the way it was, and they left it. Then Dr. Albee, during all the Depression years, never did anything. Just held on to the property. And after his death, his wife, Luella, inherited the property, inherited the bank and the waterworks and all the streets and all the sidewalks and all the buildings and everything else. And then she sold everything lock, stock, and barrel to a man named Robert S. Baynard. And I moved to Venice about 2 years after that sale. And Mr. Baynard had set up shop, and he was busy selling lots. And that's sort of the story. That's what was here when I moved here. Bob Baynard was a lawyer, a University of Florida College of Law. So we had that in common when I met him. His family, he was from a very prominent St. Petersburg family. The banking, they had the largest funeral home in Pinellas County. He was a lawyer, but he was also what I'd call an entrepreneur, developer. And he bought this and and did very well.
Obviously.
Yeah. Because, for example, when I moved here, I soon found out that there was one bank in town, and he was the only stockholder. He owned the bank, the Venice Nokomis Bank, lock, stock, and barrel.
Oh, my goodness.
So that if you wanted a loan, you went to see Mr. Baynard.
Where did he live?
His house was at the corner of Bayshore and Park Boulevard.
Okay.
Is where they lived during the week and go home on the weekends.
Ah, I see. So, okay, so you've arrived here, you found out who has the money to borrow.
We had no money whatsoever, and we had to borrow to get going.
So you were going to start a business, and where did you find a place to live?
Well, there weren't many choices. Venice, there weren't many choices, we'll put it this way. So we got an apartment on Venice Avenue, right at the corner of Nokomis Avenue and Venice Avenue. Upstairs, fronting out on Venice Avenue. Upstairs, fronting on Venice Avenue, and over the B&B bar. And the thing I can remember about the B&B bar that we can remember most is it was a redneck bar if there ever was one. And when it would close up at 2 o'clock in the morning, they'd all sort of stagger out onto the street and onto the sidewalk. And they'd be loud and noisy. They couldn't get their pickup trucks going, so they'd be jumping the cables and slamming the hoods. But the greatest thing about living there, right out on Venice Avenue, was across the street was the KMI, Kentucky Military Institute parade ground, what is now the downtown parking lot. That was just a big open field. And KMI had a couple loudspeakers. They had them on telephone poles and had these loudspeakers facing well, facing out onto town. And every morning at 6:30 when they played Reveille, Freda and I would just jump out of bed and stand at attention because it was so loud. We had a friend at the Venice airport, Vince Fetty, was manager of the airport. He said, "Dan, we hear that every single morning." So that's how loud it was. So and it's a ways from the airport to the, to the city.
So you got to sleep between 2 o'clock in the morning and 6:30. Is that what I'm hearing?
That was what it got down to, yeah.
Now, where was your first office?
The Venice Nokomis Bank building, which was the corner of Nassau and Venice Avenue, now torn down. It was a building that was built in 1926 and finished in 1927, and it had the first floor, which was the bank, and the second floor was where there were offices. There was only one office on the second floor, and that was the one law firm that was in Venice when we moved here. The name was Braswell and Brown, and I asked Mr. Baynard if I could rent. There was nobody else up there, just the 2 or 3 offices that they had, and I asked if I could rent straight across the hall from their door, and he was glad to rent the space to me. Mr. Braswell was an elderly lawyer who had moved here, and actually moved here to retire. And had in ill health, and then Ken Brown was 2 years ahead of me in law school, and he came here because his aunt, Mrs. Eddy's first name anyway, she was the bank. She was, I believe, the secretary of the Venice Nokomis Bank.
Oh, was it Mary Eddy?
Mary Eddy. Yes. And thank you. And anyway, so. They were here when I moved here.
So what kind of attorney business did you do here mostly? How many people lived here? 500 or so?
Yeah, the voting population, I love this. The voting population in Venice when I moved here was 411. More people lived. That was just in the city of Venice, because you had the people living in Nokomis, people living in Inglewood and South Venice area and all, but in Venice was 411 voting population.
So what kind of services did those people require mainly from you when you first got here?
Well, when we started out, I took anything that was honest work, things that I really didn't have a lot of interest in, but I was trying to earn a living. I was trying to make a living, and so I handled divorces. I handled criminal work. Shortly after I was here, I ended up with a first-degree murder case.
Oh my!
But as quickly as I could develop other work, well, like for example, Florida Power and Light Company, the law firm that I was with in Lake City, they represented Florida Power and Light Company in that part of Florida, that north part of Florida, and they had word that I was moving to Venice, or had moved to Venice, and I had a visit from Florida Power and Light, hired me to represent Florida Power and Light in this area, in this district.
Freda, you were busy with other things as well as the law firm, I presume?
Well, I worked full days.
Yes.
At the law firm,
and then
we had 2 little boys.
That's what I thought.
My parents had moved down during.
Oh, your parents lived here then?
You know, my father had retired. And I'm an only child, and so they felt that, hey, why don't we move? Why don't we move to Venice? And they did.
Oh, good.
And so I had my parents here, and Freda had built-in babysitters.
Oh, right. Excellent. So, and when did they pass away here?
Yes.
And when was that?
My father in there was 10 years difference. My mother lived 10 years after my father, 1970 and 1980.
Well, how nice that you had them here, especially when you're raising your boys.
Oh, yes.
And we may as well go ahead and talk about your boys for a minute, because they were born here in Venice Hospital,
Yes.
and they grew up to be...
Well, they grew up to be students at the University of Florida, graduated from University of Florida Law School, and then came here and joined the firm, came straight from school here, went to work.
And not too long ago, you added another family member to your firm.
Yes, we did. Jeff's daughter, our granddaughter, Caroline Boone, and what a joy! And we now have Jeff has in law school as freshman students his twin son and twin daughter, Jackson and Annie. They're in law school, and then Steve has his son, who is Stuart, who is in his second year of law school. So the next generation of Boones is getting ready to come on board. Yeah,
that's wonderful. Congratulations to both of you. That's really a great success story. So let's go back to when y'all were young and had no idea that everything was going to turn out so great.
That's true.
So you moved from the bank building and you moved over to what's the Comcast building now, right?
It's Comcast now. What happened there was Florida Power and Light Company was going to build a new district headquarters, and they bought this piece of property on Miami Avenue, and then when I found out that they were going to build a building, I asked Florida, because of being representing them, I therefore knew them well, and we were looking for a place to move. The Venice Tacoma's Bank was old and falling apart, and we were looking for a place to move, and asked them, would they put a second floor on their building, and could we in turn lease that second floor for our law offices? And they said no problem at all. In other words, yeah, we'll put a second floor up there. And so we moved there and stayed, I believe, 17 years.
Oh, my.
I believe that we stayed in that building. We moved out, Florida Power and Light moved out, and we moved out at the same time.
And one of the things I want to ask you about is the golf course. As I understand it, there was no place where people didn't have to belong to a country club to play golf. And Smitty Brohard, I believe, was your mayor. Do you know him pretty well?
Very well.
Well, tell us a little bit about how the golf course came to be, and tell us about Smitty, too.
Well, Smith Brohard, what is now Pineapples, there was when I moved here a bar and grill, and that was Smitty's, and had the best hamburgers in town, and he was civic minded. He wasn't just running a bar, but he was a civic minded person who got involved in trying to bring Venice along, and ended up city council, then ended up mayor for several years. And he was a golfer. And then when Publix bought going back, when BLE came here, they built a 9-hole golf course where Country Club Estates is now.
And Publix.
In Publix, in that Publix shopping center. They built a 9-hole golf course and put up a clubhouse. When I moved here, the one half of the roof had fallen in of the clubhouse. The other half still, the roof was still on, and that's where Rotary met, and that's where Kiwanis met. Just didn't have much around here by way of meeting places. But anyway, when they bought that property, they closed the golf course because they were going to. Well, they sold off the Country Club Estates part, and so Smith Brohard came up with the idea of, hey, there's this great big airport out here, nothing on all this acres and acres of land. Why don't we see if the FAA would allow us to put a golf course on the airport? And I went to at that time, FAA headquarters for Florida is in Orlando now, but it was in Miami then. And I went to Miami, and guess what? They were favorable, because what they look for is income to help support the airport. And they, of course, saw that a golf course would create lease rental for the FAA, and so they okayed it, and the golf course was built, and that was in 1960.
1960,
and Smith Brohard was really the driving force of that, and Bob Baynard was the money man. Bob Baynard's the one that loaned the money to be able to build a golf course.
Tell us about, you hired Jack Ogle to fly the air. When was that?
I have to think about dates.
Okay.
Jack retired from the Navy. I'm going to guess that Jack retired from the Navy in it should be here.
Oh, is it there?
Anyway, it's this picture right here. It says not every flight on the law firm's airplane was on business, and you can see what people had on that I don't know where we'd been, but we'd been somewhere, but not on business.
No. Well, okay, so Jack was your pilot, and then when your boys joined the law firm, they also got pilot's licenses. Why did you get that airplane, though?
Say that again.
Why was it that you got that airplane for the firm?
My law practice had evolved into hospital representation, hospital and nursing home representation, and in order to service the clients, normally in the normal law practice, when you have an appointment, they come here. They come in and they see you and then they go. Hospitals don't work that way. Nursing homes don't work that way. You go to them. You go and see them. And so as that business built up, we represented hospitals in Jacksonville, Daytona Beach, Orlando, Lakeland, West Palm Beach, Panama City, Pensacola, Tallahassee, Gainesville, Ocala, just all over the state. And the airplane was the way that we could, the way it was before we had the plane. I would go out and I would be gone for 2 or 3 nights at a time. And then I'd come back because there's no way that I could, say, go to Jacksonville and then come back here. But with the airplane, we could leave here in the morning and go to Jacksonville. From Jacksonville, we'd go to Tallahassee. From Tallahassee to Clearwater and back here all in one day. And that's the reason why we had the plane.
Much more efficient. When you think about it, we're a long ways from the next state, for example. I mean, it takes us all day to drive to Georgia. It takes me all day to drive to Georgia anyway. So I think people don't realize, you live in another state, you can 2 or 3 hours be in the next state, but not here.
Not here.
Yeah.
No. So. And the hospitals that were close by, that is to say, like Tampa, St. Pete, Fort Myers, those kind, Naples, you could go to those hospitals and come home the same day, sleep in your own bed that night.
Right.
But not Pensacola, for example. And then back here.
Tell us about how we ended up having that beautiful beach at our doorstep.
Well, the beachfront, which starts at Airport Avenue and goes south, was when the airport was deeded to the city of Venice after World War II. They didn't deed the beachfront, and so the federal government still owned the beachfront. And one day, Smith Brohard came to see me and said, "Dan, we just found out that the beachfront is about to be deeded to a private individual, and he's gonna then develop the beachfront. And is there anything in the world that we can do to get that beachfront for the city of Venice?" And I told him I didn't know, but I had a college friend. The stories, how they go. But I had a college friend who at that time was the #1 aide to our United States Senator, George Smathers. And of course I knew George from school too. So what followed from that was a trip to Washington, and the fact that we really need this land. And George said, Senator Smathers said, "You know, Dan, it might be too late. Let me see what I can do. It might be too late." And I guess a week or two later, he called me to say, "It's done. The deed is going to go to the city of Venice."
Oh, my goodness.
And he said, "Come up and get the deed." And I said, "No, the man who deserves that deed is our mayor, because he's the one that let us know it was going to happen, Smith Brohard." So Smith Brohard went and he got the deed.
And so that is actually the part of the beach that's called Brohard Park now. Is that correct?
Plus part of it, yeah, because it's the part where Sharkey's is located. It's the part north of Sharkey's. It's the part south of the sewer plant, or what was the sewer plant, where the dog beach is now in Brohard. All that beachfront had been undeeded. The only thing that was deeded of that beachfront was the Coast Guard, Coast Guard station, and of course it's still there.
It's still there. Well, that's fascinating. I didn't know all that before.
By the way, this is the deed. This is the deed from the United States government of the beachfront land right here. But anyway, there was a need for a new post office in Venice, because Venice had just a sliver of a storefront on Venice Avenue, and who's in there now? The bookshop's in there now, and so once again I went to Washington and to see if we could work out a post office, and the land where the Venice post office is located now, the one of the 3 hotels that were built by BLE was on that property, and so that hotel was torn down and the post office was built, and then Nokomis was in the same boat, and I was asked could I do that for Nokomis, and yes I did. I forgot the post office in Nokomis, and then the Venice in the meantime, Robert Baynard, who had been my close friend, had died. He was dead and gone, and Venice desperately needed another bank. And so I then prepared and filed a national bank application. That's Venice Nokomis Bank's a state bank, and I filed a national bank application, and it was granted. And First National Bank of Venice, which is now SunTrust, was built.
Was that Merle Grazer's bank?
Merle Grazer's bank.
Well, thanks so much for being here. We have so much more to tell you, which we'll be bringing to you again next month when Dan and Freda join us again to tell you more things about how our beautiful Venice came to be. So, Dan and Freda, we'll see you again next month.